Why not? Well, because empiricism, as Plato realized, is the world of change. And if what we're trying to do is to move on towards the unchanging conception, the grand synthesis, you see, then in the final analysis, the process of change is not governed by the sensory. It's governed by the source of form, order, the unchanging. And so Hegel, understandably, is interested in seeing reason freed from its bondage to the senses. And that reaches its culmination, you see, when in the arts, oh yes, you are working creatively with sensory material. You see, reason is really working, and particularly if you're the romanticist, imaginatively, not slavishly, imaginatively working with sensory material. And in religion, even more so. And in philosophy, yes. That's where you get most concrete. Yeah. Most concrete thought comes in philosophy. You see? Because thought is dealing with concept, not with sensory objects. So this is what he's after. The avoidance of what is static, abstract, the development of the concrete. Now, when he's dealing with this, remember that the lens through which he sees things on this vast screen is the lens of our own self-consciousness. Okay? So what he's doing in this phenomenology, remember phenomenology is a description. What he's engaged in is sometimes impersonation, role play, you see, empathetic description. He's entering into the reflection, the feelings of the individual or in the situation he's describing, entering into it empathetically, not standing outside describing behaviors, but entering inside to capture what is it like in the emerging consciousness, you see. Phenomenology, we'll find as it moves on into the 20th century, is concerned with the structures of our conscious being in the world. You see? He's trying to trace out the dialectical structure of our conscious being in the world. He's not trying to deal with the consciousness in abstraction from the world. That was Descartes' mistake, shutting himself in a stove-heated room of all things and asking if the world exists. How abstract can you get? You see. William Temple, who was a neo-Hegelian philosopher in England, became Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1940s. He has a chapter in one of his books entitled Descartes' Faux Pas. His faux pas was to shut himself up in a room and ask himself if anything existed. And can't you imagine Descartes stoking the stove to keep warm while wondering if his body exists? You know, self-contradictoriness of the abstract. But no, the concern is with the structures of conscious being. Notice the term being. You see the concept of being. What being is revealed through our self-consciousness. So you look at our self-conscious being in the world, in relationship to. Now, you see, there was a tendency back in the 17th, 18th century for the individual to be regarded as a Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe was a social philosopher. He wasn't just a kid story writer. What he was writing was a piece of social satire when he wrote Robinson Crusoe. In his more philosophical writings, what Daniel Defoe writes about is the isolated individual, ruled by reason, self-sufficient, living alone on his island with his goats and his God. You see? And he doesn't need others. He's able to bring nature under the rule of reason, provide for himself. When the savages come, he keeps away from them until he sees them just about to make dinner of Friday. So he rescues man Friday, but keeps him in submission until he becomes rational enough that they can enter into social contract. You see? When the Spanish sailors come, they keep away from them. They're not rational. You see? When the British sailors come, it's another story. They enter into social contract and sail back to England. Defoe knew what he was doing. The individual is an isolated island, self-sufficient. Not so for Hegel. There's no such thing as an individual in isolation. Even self-consciousness does not exist in isolation. You see, he's interested in the structures of our conscious being in the world. There's no other being than in the world for the individual. I just wish Hegel had written another Robinson Crusoe to depict this. It would have been a little bit better than the Phenomenology of Mind, wouldn't it, Bob? Maybe you should do that. He starts then with the subjective spirit, and if you have the outline with you, you notice that the realm of subjective or individual spirit begins with a thesis having to do with sense consciousness. Now you'll see sense consciousness is not the same as self-consciousness. Sense consciousness is something which indeed the animal has. In fact, that level of the dialectic simply carries over from the end of the grand antithesis about nature dealing with organisms that worked down to a description of physiology, which physiology gives rise to consciousness on the part of animal life. So sense consciousness is simply the, if you like, part of the synthesis in nature, now becoming the thesis for a new antithesis. Okay? Sense consciousness rooted in the biological. Brain processes. Sensory awareness. But sense consciousness is simply consciousness of the other. Consciousness of the other. And that stands in antithesis to consciousness of oneself. Sense consciousness, self-consciousness. But you don't really have mind, spirit, reason at work, free, until that self-consciousness in dealing with the world of sense consciousness achieves its freedom in that world of sense consciousness. And so it's not just self-consciousness isolated, but rather self-consciousness at work, reflectively, rationally, freely, creatively, doing something to shape the world of sense consciousness. And that is the stepping stone over into objective spirit, into talking about law and order in society. Because what is law and order? But the work of reason ordering the world of sense consciousness. Get the transitions? Now, you have, in the anthology, two pieces taken from the section on subjective spirit. One is the master-servant, and the other is the stoic, skeptic, unhappy consciousness. What's going on in those selections? Well, I think in the light of what I've said, you can already anticipate what's going on. The master-servant piece is famous. You find it referred to again and again. The concept of alienation arises out of this. Concept of alienation that was at work in the early existentialists, at work in Marx and Engels, at work even in the political correctness movement today. You see, asserting political correctness to overcome alienation of minority groups. Concept of alienation. We'll find in Sartre that we come back to this. Basically, what it's about is the fact that one only achieves self-consciousness in relationship to the other. You see? You only achieve self-consciousness in relationship to the other. So this is, if you like, a phenomenology of emerging self-consciousness. It's an empathetic description of what the master goes through, what the servant goes through, what they go through in relationship to each other. You see, even in terms of the meaning of the words master and servant, there is no such thing as a master who doesn't have a servant. He's not a master if he doesn't have one. There's no such thing as a servant if he doesn't have a master. You see? What is he? He doesn't know. He's out of work. So that one's identity is dependent on that relationship. One's identity is dependent on that relationship. By the same token, there is no subject without an object. There's no object without a subject that it's the object of. These are relational terms. These are polarities. There we go, polarities. And the dialectic is what he's tracing, the dialectic within this polarity. The isolated self is always incomplete. We have to see the individual self in relationship to the other. Now, in order then to achieve self-identity, the one standing in opposition to the other thinks he has to cancel out the other, negates the other. I'm the master. Whereupon the servant proceeds to make the master utterly dependent on him, the servant. Now who's the master? You see the self-destructiveness, the self-contradiction in affirming that I am the master independently. Because to be a master, I have to have a servant on whom I depend. Who then is the master? There's a self-contradiction involved. Master-servant relationship. So that in order to be certain of myself, I negate the other, but in doing so I negate myself.